Welcome everybody, good evening, and welcome to those online as well. Hopefully you're still with us. Apologies for the slight delay, slightly rusty tech, but hopefully we're up and running and lessons learned and we're good to go. So really welcome to everyone for the first talk of our 2024-2025 series of talks. Good to see you all, and we've got a really exciting speaker for us tonight. So I'll cut straight to it, really, in the interest of time. But our speaker, we give a warm welcome to Dr. Michael Byrne from the University of St Andrews for our opening talk this season. Dr. Mike Byrne is a reader at the University of St Andrews, where he leads the Climate Dynamics Lab. The overarching goal of his research is to advance fundamental physical knowledge of climate and climate change. The lab's research philosophy is distinctive, combining a hierarchy of computer models with theory and observational data to develop a robust understanding of climate. Dr. Byrne was an author of the UN's IPCC 6 Assessment Report and is currently co-chair of the World Climate Research Programme's Climate Dynamics Panel. So a brief abstract before we hear all about it. The title of the talk is Extreme Temperatures Over a Range of Climate States. Understanding the sensitivity of extreme temperatures to climate change is a key scientific challenge with important societal implications. Yet basic questions persist regarding extreme temperatures, including why hot days and the average day warm at different rates, and the role of local versus remote processes controlling extreme temperatures. Dr. Byrne and his team have used a suite of simulations performed using idealized climate models to explore extreme temperatures over a range of climate states. In tropical regions, the responses of extreme temperatures to climate warming contrast strongly over land and over sea. So we're going to hear all about the results and some theories from these studies and consider the sensitivity of extratropical extreme temperatures to climate change. So over to you, Mike, and for those online, we'll do a Q&A at the end. I will ask you for questions and you can ask Mike directly, or we can type the questions in the chat and I'll pick them up for you there. So over to you, Mike.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm going to try and move my laptop very carefully so I don't disconnect this podium.
It's a Rhapsody. No. Or Dodgy Steve the Legend.
No. Okay, that seems to go.
What I want it to be. I just know which one I want it to be. I might just rule out.
Is it that? Yeah, great. Okay, so thanks very much for the introduction, and it's really great to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to share some of our work. Okay, so maybe let me just try and get rid of this. Okay, so so what I'm going to talk about is extreme temperatures, but really the temperature distribution more broadly and how it responds to climate change. So I'll give a reasonably lengthy or reasonably substantial introduction, I guess, to this topic to motivate what we're doing. And then I'll get into some results that we've been working on recently using predominantly quite idealized climate models, but I'll also show some results from more comprehensive models. And this, I should say, this is work largely in collaboration with Josh Duffield, who's a PhD student in the Climate Dynamics Lab at St Andrews. Okay. Right, so when we think about climate change, often the focus is on the global mean warming. And here we have a figure showing historical warming. So this is from the last IPCC report. So on the left-hand side of this figure, we have the mean historical warming, globally averaged. And then moving into the future, we have potential future global warmings depending on different emissions scenarios. And it's long been known and is increasingly being observed that extreme events, be it extreme temperatures, extreme rainfall events, hurricanes, are responding to this mean warming. We don't have to cast our minds too far back to think of very extreme weather events, which we think have been influenced by climate change. So there was a devastating flooding in Pakistan in 2022, Hurricane Helene just a few weeks ago, and also some extreme temperature events. So the UK broke 40 degrees Celsius in 2022. And then on the bottom right, we have a map showing surface temperature anomalies during the Pacific Northwest heat wave, which was a really remarkable heat wave that hit northwestern US and Western Canada in 2021. I'll talk a bit more about the Pacific Northwest heat wave shortly. And the focus of my talk today is really on temperature and how do we expect these extreme temperature events to change into the future. And really kind of the scientific question I'm interested in is fairly basic. Those very, very hot days, do we expect them to warm faster or slower than, for example, the average day? That's really the question that I'm interested in. Okay, so when we think about extreme temperatures in a changing climate, we often present a schematic that looks like this. You may have seen something like this before. So we can imagine a probability distribution of, say, daily temperature, for example, at some, any point on Earth's surface. So it has some distribution, and the average day has some temperature, and then there's lower probabilities of having a cold day on the left or a warm day as you move to the right. So if we, say, define a hot day to be any day over, say, 25 degrees Celsius, and a cold day to be anything below 5 degrees, when we warm the climate, if we just shift that distribution to the right to a warmer mean temperature, but don't change its shape, which might be the simplest thing you might expect to happen under climate change, that you warm the average temperature, but don't change the variance or the skewness of your distribution, then it's a very straightforward result that if you keep your thresholds for hot and cold fixed, then you expect to have more hot days in a warmer climate and fewer cold days, or the area under the curve becomes larger for hot days and smaller for cold days. So it's a very straightforward consequence of climate change if you just shift the distribution to a warmer mean state. And broadly speaking, state-of-the-art climate models show this result. So when you warm up climate models, they generally show a higher probability of having warm days. So what's shown here are projections from different climate models. So each line is a different climate model. And in blue, it's showing the probability ratio, or how the probability of, in blue, the 1 in 100 warmest day relative to pre-industrial, how that changes as you move to the right. So as you warm the mean climate, you increase for the blue lines, you increase the probability of experiencing that 1 in 100 warmest day versus pre-industrial conditions. Okay, so warmer mean climate, more frequent warm days. And the red lines are the 1 in 1,000 warmest day. So a higher level of percentile, so more extreme event. And actually those events scale more quickly with global mean warming. So when you go to a mean warming of, for example, 1 degree Celsius, then you see that the 1 in 1,000 warmest day becomes about 10 times more likely compared to pre-industrial conditions. Okay, so models generally show this behavior that hot days become more frequent as you warm the mean climate, and that's not a surprising result. You don't need me to tell you that more hot days in a changing climate is generally bad news for a variety of reasons, for human health, animal health, wildfire risk, and agriculture. And there's some quite remarkable impact statistics when you look into literature. So for example, the 2003 European heat wave is estimated to have claimed 70,000 lives over a 2-week period. And the 2018 Northern Australian heat wave is estimated to have killed about 1/3 of the population of flying fox bats in Australia. So these are really severe impacts from these kind of very extreme hot days. And so obviously it's quite an important scientific question, but also an important question for society about how these very high amplitude events may change in the future. Okay, so if we go back to our little schematic, so I talked about this very idealized scenario where we just shift the distribution to a warmer mean state without changing its shape. That gives you more hot days. But scientifically, a very interesting question is whether you expect the shape of the distribution to also change when you warm the climate. So for example, if you change the shape quite subtly on this warm tail of the distribution, then perhaps you might have actually amplified warming of hot days relative to the average days. You might see hot days warming faster than average, or indeed you might have suppressed warming of hot days. And really, in terms of, I guess, the climate science of extreme temperatures, It's really focused on this question. How do we expect the shape of this distribution to change as the mean climate warms, and what are the implications for extreme temperatures? So turning back now to climate models, there are indications from climate models, in this case, that very hot days are warming at a different rate to, in this case, the global average temperature. So this is a figure from a paper by Sonia Senevratne and colleagues a few years ago, showing on the left the hottest day in the Mediterranean region, and on the right, the hottest day each year in the contiguous United States. And the blue and red lines show projections from climate models moving into the future. And the y-axis is how those hot days are warming into the future, and the x-axis is the global mean temperature. And the little black dotted lines you can see are the one-to-one lines. So what's shown here is models are projecting that the warming of these very hot days in these regions is quite a bit faster than the global average temperature, which is suggesting some interesting changes in the distribution of temperature. You see a similar result if you look at the observational record. So what's shown here are anomalous temperatures. The red lines are two observational-based estimates of the hottest day each year over mid-latitude land in the Northern Hemisphere. And then the gray line you can see lying beneath is, again, the global mean surface temperature. And what we've seen over the last, I guess, 40 years or so is a tendency for these very hot days in the Northern Hemisphere over land, in particular, that they're warming at a faster rate than the global average temperature, again suggesting amplified warming of these warmer days. Just going back to now a mix of models and observations. So what's shown here, first, if we look on the right, is what's called a warming ratio. So how the warmest 10% of days at a given location have warmed relative to the mean warming at any location. So if you look on the right, this is the result from models over the historical period. And any regions that show up as red are showing that those 10% warmest days are warming faster than the mean. So for the models, it's pretty overwhelming that over most land regions, hot days are warming faster than the average day. But it's less clear-cut if you look on the left. So this is data from ERA 5 reanalysis. It's an observations-based product, but it combines observations with a model. And it's less clear-cut, actually. So we see quite a difference between the climate models on the right and the observational-based data on the left, where it's less clear-cut that the hot days are warming faster. Okay. So there's some evidence that particularly over land, we're seeing this amplified warming of hot days. And this feeds into, we think, potentially feeds into these record-shattering events. This term has recently been coined, which we've been seeing over the last number of years. So this is a figure from a paper by Eric Fisher on the Pacific Northwest heat wave. And on the right is the temperature anomaly relative to the seasonal average during that event. So you're seeing anomalous temperatures of about 12 degrees above the seasonal average. So really, really unusual event and a very, very high amplitude event. And on the right in red are the temperatures between June and August in 2021. That's the red line, and then gray are all the years between 1950 and 2020. So you see, kind of coming into the middle of June, you see this huge departure from the historical record and a very, very large temperature being set. So Canada broke its all-time temperature record by almost 5 degrees during this event, reaching a temperature of almost 50 degrees Celsius. So a really remarkable event. So this is a figure from a different paper showing the 2-meter temperature record and how much it was exceeded by at each place over Northwest North America. So on the top is for the Pacific Northwest heat wave. So you see in some locations you had records broken by up to 6 degrees Celsius. So huge jump in the records. And this is a lot more in terms of this metric of how remarkable event this was. It's quite a bit more dramatic, for example, compared to the bottom left, which is the 2003 European heat wave, or the 2010 heat wave in Russia, where you saw records being broken, but nowhere near by the same magnitude. So during the Pacific Northwest heat wave, the Canadian temperature record was set in Lytton, a small town in British Columbia. And this is the temperature record for that town. So it broke the Canadian temperature record on 3 consecutive days, June 27th, 28th, and 29th. And then on the 30th, it burnt down due to a wildfire. So a very stark example of the impacts of extreme temperatures in a changing climate. Okay, so going back to this schematic, so if we move beyond the average temperature, and if we're trying to understand those high amplitude events, how can we think about potential changes in the shape of this distribution with warming? And this is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my talk. So I think there's some pretty basic and pretty open questions when it comes to the temperature distribution in a changing climate. So we're seeing some evidence from models and observations that different parts of the distribution are warming at different rates. And I'm interested in how physically can that happen. So what are the physical processes driving different parts of the temperature distribution to change at different rates? How does the response of the temperature distribution depend on the climate state? So by climate state, I mean, does it vary between ocean and land regions, for example? Do you see differing changes in the distribution, dry or wet regions, or indeed low versus high latitudes? What processes drive uncertainties in the response of the distribution or in the response of extremes to climate change? That's another question which is not particularly well understood. And broadly, what we're kind of aiming for, in my group, but also many other research groups around the world, is we're trying to develop a global understanding of how the temperature of, say, the X percentile of the distribution, how that responds to climate change. Can we express that as a function of some other quantities in the climate system? So in the rest of my talk, I'm going to touch on each of these questions. I will by no means give definitive answers to these questions, but I'll show some results which I hope you find interesting. Okay, so the outline for the rest of the talk. So I'm going to focus on the tropics in this talk for a few reasons which I'll get into. So I'm going to focus on the tropical temperature distribution, so the near surface temperature distribution from 20 degrees south to 20 degrees north. And I'm going to study that using some simulations with an idealized global climate model, or idealized GCM. And then I'm going to get into developing some physical theory to understand what's going on in those idealized simulations. And then we'll also talk a bit about more comprehensive models with the bells and the whistles. And then at the end, I'll briefly discuss about how we're thinking about extending the tropical ideas to the extratropics before concluding. Okay, so first of all, why focus on the tropics? There's a few reasons. So this is the figure I showed earlier, showing the warming ratio, or the trends in the hottest 10% of days divided by the trends in the average day at each point over land in climate models. And there is difference between the models and the observations in this quantity, but what the models show at least is quite amplified warming of those hot days, particularly in the tropics. So if you look at the Amazon or the Sahel region, you see quite deep red colors, which is indicating that those 10% warmest days are actually warming quite a bit faster than the average day. So we thought if we're interested in understanding this amplified warming, the tropics is a good place to start, because at least in the models, the signal is quite large. So that's one reason. Another reason is that I guess the tropics has not been particularly extensively studied when it comes to extreme temperatures. There's been a lack of historical data and also a lack of kind of data in databases of extreme events. So there's kind of a lack of study of these events in tropical regions, which we're interested in trying to help alleviate. And also in the tropics, you have a lot of vulnerable regions and vulnerable communities. So when these events hit, they can be quite impactful, which is another reason why we're interested in studying them. Okay, so I'm going to now describe the simulations that we use to study this problem. And we use an aquaplanet. So we use an idealized climate model that's called ISCA. It's developed primarily by colleagues based at the University of Exeter. And it's quite an idealized model. And I'm going to show results where we've run it in two quite idealized configurations. The first on the left, I hope you like my artistic rendition of an aquaplanet. So it's a planet with no land. Just have basically like a swamp at the surface, which can heat up or cool down. It can evaporate water, but doesn't move around like a real ocean does. And sitting above that swamp, we have a fully dynamic atmosphere, but with quite simple radiation. So we use a gray radiation scheme with prescribed optical thicknesses, but it's a fully dynamic atmosphere. So I'll mostly talk about results in this aquaplanet configuration, but I will show a few results where we investigate a slightly more complex configuration with a meridional land band. So basically a continent of fixed 60 degrees in longitude that spans from pole to pole. And in these configurations, the only difference between land and ocean is that for land, we implement what's called a bucket model, which is perhaps the simplest model for land hydrology. So basically, the evaporation from the land surface depends on how full your bucket is. Okay, so the only difference between land and ocean is that land can dry out through this bucket model, but in all other ways, they're the same. Okay, I'm going to focus on this aquaplanet results for most of the talk. Okay, so here's so I should have said before I get on to the results, what we do with this model is what people have done with this type of model going back maybe 15 years, but it's used as it's not meant to be very realistic, okay? But what it is meant to allow you to do is to use it as a computational laboratory to probe going from very cold climates to very hot climates, and how does a phenomenon of interest vary over a wide range of conditions. So we use it to build physical understanding of the real climate system in an idealized setting, but we hope that that gives us insight into what's going on in the real climate. Okay, so that's the idea here. So what we do with this model is we run a control simulation, and then we also run a series of colder simulations and warmer simulations, and we look at how the temperature distribution varies over that wide range of climate states. And to change the climate, what we do is we change the long-wave optical thickness in our gray radiation model, and you can think of that as basically changing the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere by a lot. That's basically what we're doing. Okay. So when we do that, we generate, so in this case, I have 8 simulations here. So each little group of dots are the results from a different simulation. And what I've plotted are percentiles, so the 90th, the 95th, and the 99th percentile of daily temperature, so kind of temperatures on the warmer side of the distribution. I'm plotting those for each simulation, going from cold, so the mean temperature is on the x-axis, so we're going from cold simulations on the left to very hot simulations on the right. And those filled dots in the middle are our control Earth-like simulation. Okay. So what we see, so the red dashed line is the one-to-one line, and what we see is that those high percentiles of temperature, so those warm and hot days, as the whole climate warms, those days actually don't warm as fast as the average day. So what we're seeing here in the aquaplanet simulation is kind of in contrast to a lot of what I've talked about so far. So a lot of the results I've shown from more comprehensive models and from observations was suggesting that hot days over land, and that's important, are warming faster than the average. But here on the aquaplanet, we're seeing the opposite. So those hot days are actually warming less fast than the average day. They're warming at about 85% of the rate of the average temperature. So we quantify this effect using something called a scaling factor. And I'll be talking about scaling factors quite a bit. So basically what it is it's the change, so delta Tx, so it's the change or the trend in the x percentile of the temperature distribution, where x could be 1 for a very cold day or 99 for a very hot day, divided by the trend in the mean temperature, which is indicated with an over bar here. So this is the scaling factor for our aquaplanet, looking globally for now. And what we see is that those cold percentiles on the left have a scaling factor above 1, indicating that those cold days are actually warming faster than the average day. And it's the opposite for the hot days. They're warming less fast. So if we think about a temperature distribution, so some bell curve or a Gaussian, then what these results are suggesting is that when we warm the climate, we're moving to a warmer mean state, but actually we're narrowing the distribution. So if your hot days are not warming as fast as your mean, then you tend to narrow the distribution if the cold days are warming faster than the mean. Okay, so that's an interesting result. So that's globally. I said I was going to focus on the tropics, and here's the scaling factor for the tropics. So we see qualitatively similar behavior, with the cool days warming faster than the mean and the warm days warming less fast. So the task over the next number of slides is I'm going to try, I guess, develop what ends up being a reasonably simple physical theory to try basically understand this effect. So why do we see this narrowing of the distribution with warming in the tropics for an aquaplanet? Okay, so to build that theory, I'm going to talk about two features of the tropical climate, which are quite well established, but if you're not used to thinking about climate or the atmosphere in tropical latitudes, they may not be super familiar to you. So I'll step through them. So the first ingredient of the theory is that we're going to assume that in the tropics that there's a lot of convection, basically a lot of thunderstorms, which is quite a good place to start in the tropics because it is quite well convectively coupled. So at most places in the tropics, you have quite frequent convection, which basically mixes air from the subcloud layer with air in the free troposphere. And this idea is well established in the tropical dynamics literature, and it's known as convective quasi-equilibrium, or CQE. So the first idea I'm going to rely upon is that there is this frequent mixing of air up and down in the tropics, okay? In the tropics, we're close to the equator, of course, and because we're close to the equator, the Coriolis force is relatively weak in the tropics, and we're often quite far from geostrophic balance. And a very important consequence of having a weak Coriolis force is that if you go above the boundary layer, so you don't need to worry about surface friction, in the tropics, you tend to have very spatially uniform temperatures. So if you're sitting in the tropical free troposphere and you're looking around you, you'll be looking at temperatures that are very similar to the temperature at the point where you're sitting. And the reason is that if you have a weak Coriolis force, it's difficult to sustain horizontal temperature or pressure gradients. So the result is that you have quite a flat temperature structure. And this is known as the weak temperature gradient approximation. So basically any perturbation to the temperature in the tropical free troposphere is very efficiently washed out by gravity waves. You can think of dropping a pebble in a pond. It's difficult to maintain a mound of water in a pond, and similarly in the tropical free troposphere, you tend to have a very flat temperature structure. Okay, so it turns out that these two features of the tropical atmosphere have very important implications for temperature broadly. So they help to explain why land warms more than ocean under climate change, and they can also help explain how the temperature distribution responds to a changing climate. Okay, so I'll step through kind of a bit of the maths behind the theory, but really the important point is that convection and weak temperature gradients impose a constraint on how near surface temperature in the tropics can change in a changing climate. Okay, so first the convection part. So if you have frequent convection in the tropics, if you're frequently mixing that air up and down, you tend to vertically homogenize conserved quantities. And in the atmosphere, adiabatic quantities that are conserved under moist adiabatic displacements are things like equivalent potential temperature, which is like potential temperature, but it includes the effects of moisture, or moist static energy. And I'm going to use moist static energy in this talk because it's algebraically, it's actually an easier quantity to work with than equivalent potential temperature, but they're both examples of quantities that are conserved if you move parcels of air around adiabatically, and they take into account latent heat release. Okay, so if you have convection mixing air up and down, then what this implies is that changes in moist static energy, denoted here by H, near the surface, are mirrored by, are the same as changes in the saturation moist static energy in the free troposphere, indicated by an FT here. And moist static energy, if you're near the surface, moist static energy is just the energy contained in an air parcel. You neglect the kinetic energy. The moist static energy is just a function of the temperature of the air and the specific humidity of the air, Q. If you're thinking about MSE in the free troposphere, then you also need to include the effect of geopotential energy if the air is high above the surface. But the key point here is that if convection links the near surface to the free troposphere, the energy basically of those two air masses changes in a similar way when you change the climate because they're linked via convection. If you push this assumption a bit further and say that it applies not just to the mean moist static energy, but also to every percentile of the moist static energy distribution, that's the second equation here. And then if we invoke weak temperature gradients, then that suggests that changes in the saturation MSE in the free troposphere, which is a function of temperature because it's a saturation quantity, weak temperature gradient suggests that's the same for the mean day, but also for every percentile x. And if you just basically stick these equations together, what you end up with is a very simple prediction that changes in the mean moist static energy near the surface are approximately equal to changes at every percentile x. So if we go back to thinking about our distribution, so if you remember talking about the temperature distribution on the aquaplanet, when we warmed, that tended to squeeze together and narrow. But for moist static energy, if these predictions hold, then actually the moist static energy distribution does not change its shape as it warms. So although temperature squeezes distribution with warming, the moist static energy distribution moves to a warmer mean value, but maintains its shape. That's what this equation implies. It basically implies that all percentiles of the distribution warm at the same rate. And this is borne out approximately in our simulations. So what's shown here are the changes. So these are basically scaling factors in blue for the temperature, in orange for near surface specific humidity, and in green for moist static energy. So for the blue line first, we saw what we've seen already, that the temperature distribution tends to narrow when you warm the climate. The opposite happens for specific humidity near the surface, the orange line. So the lower percentiles increase by less than the higher percentiles. So in terms of humidity, the humidity distribution actually broadens when you warm the climate. But green is moist static energy, a combination of temperature and specific humidity. And that's fairly flat. So it's close, this scaling factor is close to 1, not exactly 1, but close to 1, suggesting that these dynamical constraints are actually constraining how the energy of the air near the surface is changing with climate. Okay, so you might be saying to yourself, moist static energy sounds like an interesting quantity, but what relevance does it have for the temperature? We're normally interested in how temperature distributions respond. So you can basically turn this, so moist static energy near the surface, just a function of temperature and specific humidity. So you can go through a few fairly straightforward algebraic steps, which I'm not going to dwell on. But when you do, and you do some rearranging, what you end up with is a prediction. So as scientists, it's very nice to make predictions, which we can then test in a variety of ways. And this is the prediction for how the temperature distribution, so how the change in the temperature in the x percentile of the temperature distribution responds to a change in climate. So we have a whole bunch of stuff on the right-hand side. So this theory suggests that the change in the temperature of, say, the 90th percentile, or whatever you choose x to be, depends on the mean temperature change, okay? And it also depends on changes in relative humidity. So relative humidity is the fraction of the saturation specific humidity that an air parcel has, okay? So relative humidity can change as you change the climate. And according to this theory, that affects how the temperature responds. And this will be a theme that will come up in the remainder of my talk. This is a tight coupling between how temperature responds to climate change and how humidity responds. So it depends on temperature changes and humidity changes. And then it also depends on these prefactors, which are just climatological quantities. So quantities in principle you could go out and measure in the current climate, and physical constants. Okay, so when we go back to our simulations, this is our scaling factor. And if we apply this theory, this is the dotted line here. So what we find is that the theory, it's not perfect, but it does a reasonably good job at capturing what's going on in the model. So this suggests that these constraints are actually quite important for the tropical temperature distribution. So that's useful because now we can probe the theory and say, okay, physically, why are we seeing this type of change in the temperature distribution? So that's what I'm going to do. And to make our lives simpler, I'm going to make every climate scientist's favorite assumption, which is I'm going to neglect that second term on the right-hand side of my equation, which is changes in relative humidity. That's often not a bad assumption for if you're thinking about climate change, and I'm going to make that assumption here, at least for now. So I'm just going to take this first term of the equation and try to interpret physically what's going on. Okay, and the dotted line here is the estimate from the theory when we make this constant relative humidity assumption. So when you assume that the relative humidity doesn't change, your prediction becomes a bit worse because you're now neglecting some information, which is useful, but it still qualitatively captures what's going on. So it's that's useful. Okay, so if we go to now we have this kind of more simple prediction for changes in the x percentile of temperature that just depends on the right-hand side on the mean temperature change. So that's just the same for all our predictions, no matter what the percentile. So all the structure in how different percentiles warm is determined by this pre-factor. And in particular, what's important in this pre-factor is this ratio that I've highlighted with the red box, which is basically the specific humidity Q on the average day, that's Q bar, divided by the specific humidity on the x percentile of, conditioned on the x percentile of temperature. So what this tells us is that the response of the temperature distribution depends on how dry or how moist air is on hot days relative to the mean day. So if we plot specific humidity now conditioned on percentiles of temperature, okay, what we see is that for cooler days on our aquaplanet, we have quite low specific humidity. So cool days are dry, and on the right, warmer days or hot days are moist. And this is very much a feature of an aquaplanet. You have this very tight correspondence between how warm the air is and how much moisture is in the air. Because for an aquaplanet, there's no limitations on how much moisture you can evaporate from the surface. So when you're warmer, you tend to be wetter in terms of specific humidity. So this is basically the explanation for why the temperature distribution tends to narrow when you warm the climate. So because the cool days are dry, this Qx is less than Q bar. So for a cool day on an aquaplanet, you have less specific humidity than you do on the average day. So this ratio in the red box is greater than 1, and that suggests that the warming of the x percentile, so a cool day, is greater than the warming of the average day. So because for an aquaplanet, cool days are dry, they warm more in a changing climate, and it's the opposite for warm days. Because they're moist, this ratio is now less than 1, so you see less warming for warm days compared to the average day. Okay, so this is for an aquaplanet. I mentioned these simulations with the meridional land band here, which can dry out and which does dry out in our simulations. And when you look at the scaling factor in those simulations in red, we see fundamentally different behavior. So for an aquaplanet, we see a scaling factor which indicates a narrowing of the distribution with warming, so less temperature variance in a warmer climate. But for land, we see a broadening of the distribution. So for land, the hottest days are warming faster than the average day in this idealized model, and this more reflects what we see in more comprehensive models. So we think this is quite interesting. So there's fundamentally different responses of the temperature distribution depending on whether the surface is wet in the case of the aquaplanet or dry in the case of the meridional land band. And we call this mechanism the drier get hotter mechanism, because the drier you are in the current climate, the hotter you get as climate changes. And just to kind of reiterate the idea, in the tropics, we have these interesting features of the atmosphere, is that you have a lot of convection, which mixes air up and down, and you have weak temperature gradients, which kind of flattens things out across. It's kind of a non-local communicator of across the tropics. So when we warm the climate, if we first consider, say, the average day in the tropics, you warm the climate, so you increase the energy, the moist static energy of the air, through increases in the temperature of the air and also increases in the amount of water vapor held in the air. Both of those contribute to changes in the energy. If we now think about a hot day, or you could think about a hot region or hot dry region, then if we consider on the left a dry day, for example, because of these dynamical constraints, the energy must increase by the same amount on a dry day. But if you're over a dry land mass, there's often low soil moisture, so there's restricted evaporation. So to accomplish that increase in energy that's set by the large-scale dynamics, you need a bigger bump in temperature because you can't increase water vapor by as much. So this is the idea of this drier get hotter mechanism. Where moisture is limited, to increase the moist static energy by the amount set across the tropics by the large-scale dynamics, you need a bigger increase in temperature because it's harder for you to increase the amount of water vapor because there's not enough water around. So this is the drier get hotter mechanism. So I guess just we see this in more comprehensive models. So this is from a study a couple of years ago showing now looking at CMIP6 models, so kind of the state of the art. Well, they're a few years old now, but broadly speaking, the state-of-the-art climate models, which are much more sophisticated than the models I've been discussing thus far. What are shown are temperature changes in those simulations when you warm them up. On the x-axis now, averaged over days exceeding a given percentile x. So on the left-hand side of this figure is the average temperature change, and as you move to the right, you're looking at changes over higher and higher portions of the temperature distribution. So the curvature upwards of this red line is showing that the hotter days are warming more than the average day over tropical land in these more comprehensive models. And then if we applied the theory to these more comprehensive simulations, a slightly modified version of the theory that accounts for the fact that temperature and specific humidity are not typically strongly positively correlated over land, which is different to our aquaplanet. But nevertheless, a slightly modified version of the theory captures what's going on for the multi-model mean, so when you average all the models together. And also what it's able to do is it's able to replicate some of the differences across models in the responses. So here each dot is a different CMIP6 model, and what's plotted are the temperature changes in the hottest 5% of days moving into the future, and the theories on the x-axis and the simulations are on the y-axis. So we see quite a strong correlation between the two, suggesting that the theory is capable of characterizing the physical mechanisms driving this spread across models in the responses. So we think this is quite interesting. Suggests that the theory could be potentially used to pinpoint what it is about models that's causing their temperature projections to be quite different. And when we interrogate the theory a bit, what we find is a large proportion of that spread across models is related to how models change their land humidity. So Yeah, so basically some models dry out a lot and some models don't dry out as much when you change the climate, and that's what's causing a large amount of this spread across simulations. Okay, so we go back to the figure. If we apply our fixed relative humidity version of the theory, that's the dotted line. So this is kind of, now we're getting into the importance of relative humidity changes. So earlier I discussed how for the aquaplanet, it's not a bad approximation to assume relative humidity doesn't change when you change the climate, but that's a bad approximation over land, where typically we see land relative humidity decreasing as you warm the climate, and this has quite a big influence on changes in temperature. So the dotted line is what we would estimate the temperature change to be if we assume fixed relative humidity, and that'd be an underestimate. So if you want to understand the future of temperature over land, you really need to understand what's happening to relative humidity. Okay, so I'll skip this slide. So what's shown here are trends in relative humidity on the top over land. So from in situ data on the left, and then from two reanalysis products on the top right. And on the bottom, we have a time series of ocean relative humidity anomalies. So for the ocean thing, there's not a whole lot happening. So as I mentioned earlier, near surface, maybe I didn't mention earlier, but near surface humidity over the ocean, we expect that to be quite constant as you change the climate. So if relative humidity stays constant, as you warm the climate, you see large increases in specific humidity if the relative humidity is constant. But over land, we see, interestingly, since about maybe 1970 or so, these decreases globally in land relative humidity. So land is drying out in terms of relative humidity, and this is having quite a big influence on land temperatures. And in terms of the global mean or the large scale change in land relative humidity, there's something called an ocean influence mechanism, which we think is a reasonable starting point for understanding these decreases in land humidity. And that suggests basically that the moisture supply over land is dominated by what's advected in from the ocean. But if land warms more than the ocean, then the supply of moisture from the ocean can't keep pace with the increase in saturation humidity over land, implying that the land relative humidity goes down. That's okay for mean, that's an okay argument for mean changes in land humidity, so on long time averages. But if you want to understand the future of extreme temperatures, you're interested not in the mean land humidity, but on the humidity on the hottest days. And there's some really stark results. In this paper, is one showing observed changes in humidity on hot days in the Western United States. And what Karen McKinnon and co-authors found in this paper is that on hot days in this part of the world, so Western North America, specific humidity is actually declining or decreasing on hot days, which is quite a remarkable result because globally, the amount of humidity in the air is going up at about 6 to 7% per degree of warming. But for reasons which are not at all understood, on the very hottest days, the actual amount of humidity in the air is decreasing. And this is this is scientifically quite interesting. We don't understand basically why that's happening. But we think this is also very important in the context of extreme temperatures because I guess our theoretical arguments would suggest that if humidity is going down over land, then that implies a very large increase in temperature of those hottest days. I think this is quite an interesting but concerning result, particularly because climate models do not capture this drying of very hot days in these semi-arid regions of the world, suggesting that there might be potentially an important bias in models which may carry over to their predictions of extreme temperatures. Okay, so I'll wrap up in a couple of minutes, but before I do, I just want to talk about beyond the tropics, okay? So these are firmly tropical arguments, but can they help us think about how temperature extremes or temperature distributions beyond the tropics might be changing? And on the face of it, you would probably say no, because the two features of the tropical atmosphere that I've relied upon, a lot of convection and weak temperature gradients, traditionally, neither of those would be considered valid beyond the tropics. But there is some hope for these ideas. So what's shown here is basically a measure of convective coupling in the atmosphere on the left in January and on the right in July. So if we just focus on the right, I won't go into the details of the metric of convective coupling, but basically where you see red and browns on this on these maps are showing regions where a large fraction of days in the summertime are quite strong convectively coupled. So interestingly, if you look in both January and July, the tropics, most of the tropics is red or brown, suggesting that most of the tropics is quite well convectively coupled throughout the year. But if you look on the right in July, so Northern Hemisphere summer, large tracts of North America, Eurasia, Northern Africa, Europe are quite well convectively coupled. So actually this is the case over continents, not necessarily over oceans. This is suggesting that actually that first kind of mechanism I talked about, frequent convective coupling, is actually potentially not a terrible approximation for extratropical continents during summertime. And indeed, recently, there's a very nice paper by Zhang and Booz have kind of taken these tropical ideas and thought about applying them beyond the tropics. And in particular, what's shown here, so there's a few things going on in this figure, but basically what it shows is that they looked at kind of the lead up to a very extreme temperature event, and then the fall off after that event. And they composited many events in the mid latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere. So the red line shows the temperature leading up to the peak of a heat wave, basically. And then the gray line in the middle shows the precipitation. So basically what you see typically for a heat wave in the extratropical Northern Hemisphere, but we think more generally, is that you warm up and you warm up and you warm up until you become convectively unstable, at which point you generate a thunderstorm, and then you get a lot of precipitation kind of after to the right of the zero line. So basically what kills the heat wave is a thunderstorm. Okay, and thunderstorms are triggered by convection. And on the bottom, we see the moist static energy associated with these events, and that also builds up as you move into a very, very hot event until, so the little dotted cyan line is the saturation MSE in the free troposphere. So the surface MSE increases, so your air becomes hotter and hotter, moister and moister, until it triggers convection, until it becomes buoyant enough to convect and match the moist static energy in the free troposphere. You get a thunderstorm and you kill the heat wave. So this is, I think, some quite compelling observational evidence that these convective constraints are important for setting that peak temperature that you get during a heat wave. Okay, so this is the idea that convection often terminates heat waves, and convection occurs when the subcloud layer becomes warm and moist enough in order to be such that it's buoyant and triggers convection. So then how hot it gets is then limited by this. So this upper bound on temperature is then limited by how much moist static energy the subcloud layer can have. And this idea has been applied to basically try and track how the hottest days in the Northern Hemisphere extratropics are warming as climate changes. So the left side of this figure I showed before, the red lines show the warming of the hottest day over recent decades. Okay, and then on the right, it's basically just these trends of these curves on the left. But interestingly, this upper bound of TXX, so the red point with the large error bars, is a theoretical prediction based on this convective argument of how those hot days will warm. And what you see is that this kind of but you can use this idea to generate an upper bound on how hot it can get, and then you can track how that changes over time. And that matches quite well how the actual hottest day each year has evolved with climate. So I think this is quite an interesting result, because it's quite a different perspective on heat waves in the extratropics, where often we consider for example, the dynamics of blocking events or advection of air. And those processes are ultimately important, I think, but what has been less appreciated is the role of convection in constraining how hot it can get. So this is quite exciting. Okay, so I'll finish with a summary. So extreme temperatures are changing because the mean climate is changing, but I think there's a lot that we don't know about how the temperature distribution is responding. And actually, I think in some senses, our understanding of temperature is lagging behind our understanding, for example, of extreme precipitation events. So I think there's a lot of work left to do. So we use an idealized model to approach this question to kind of help us build physical understanding. And it suggests that for an aquaplanet, the distribution narrows with warming, so you have less variance. But for when you have land, you tend to widen the distribution with warming, so you have more variance. This is fundamentally dependent on having a surface which is either saturated or which can dry out. And that has a big influence on how the distribution responds. So I developed and presented a theory known as the drier get hotter theory to try and understand what's going on. And I guess ongoing work in my group at St. Andrews, we're trying to, I guess, move this theory more to the extratropics. So I didn't talk about it here, but the other ingredient of the tropical theory, weak temperature gradients, that is a bad assumption in the extratropics because you have a strong Coriolis force. So we're trying to think about ideas to meld the tropical perspective with an extratropical perspective that takes into account the dynamics of high and low pressure systems. I think ultimately those are important in the extratropics to some extent. And we're also working to understand changes in land humidity because they strongly couple to temperature. Okay, so that's it for the research. I just want to finish up with some exciting developments at St. Andrews. So St. Andrews is not traditionally a powerhouse in the weather and climate community, but we're growing. So we hopefully we'll be featuring at more of these events in the future, and I'm very excited to share the events of this group with my colleagues at St. Andrews. So, for example, we're home to now the first NCAS centre in Scotland. So NCAS is the National Centre for Atmospheric Science, and we've recently established a new centre at St. Andrews, so quite excited about that. The focus is on the use of AI and machine learning for weather and climate problems. And then also, some of you might know Simon Lee, who's a dynamical meteorologist who's just joined the faculty at St. Andrews. And relevant to this group, he's also co-editor-in-chief of Royal Met Soc's weather journal. So we feel like we're building our expertise in atmospheric dynamics and climate, and yeah, I feel it's quite an exciting time for us at St. Andrews. So yeah, so thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Mike. That was fascinating and very thought-provoking. A nice test of our mathematics on a Friday night. We'll ask a few questions. We're a little bit short on time, but I think it's an important part of the talk to get some questions in. I'll start with a relatively simple one, I think, but there might be some more technical ones in the audience and perhaps online. I saw there was some chat as well. Guide me on that, Alan. So I work alongside resilience and understanding the impacts of severe weather on the public and responders. And more recently, I'm thinking in the UK here, but it can be extrapolated, I guess. Warning for extreme heat events and understanding the impacts of extreme heat events. And we've noticed as we start to understand the impacts that both the extreme temperature seen has obviously an impact, but the longevity of the event, and we saw that even last year where we had the record-breaking temperatures. But England, the impacts are much greater, I think, because of the longevity of the event, whereas in Scotland, we broke the record for a quick day and a half, and then it was away and not too much actually happened. So my question is you talked in great detail about the distribution. So aside from that, are there any links to longevity of heat events and how that might look?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think in short, there's a lot less work on what people are now describing as persistence of heat waves. So there's been a few papers suggesting that persistence may be increasing, but I think it's currently pretty unclear why that would be the case. You can imagine some mechanisms which might kind of, which might lead to changes in persistence. So for example, if you increase CO2, and that's kind of like putting a bit of a blanket over the Earth's surface, which might make it harder for, for a heat wave to dissipate through long wave radiation. So I think you've identified what is an emerging topic. And for example, I'm involved with colleagues putting together a grant on that very topic, persistence, because I think there is quite a big gap. And actually, interestingly, we're kind of struggling to find good studies documenting how persistence relates to impacts. So actually, I might pick your brain on that, because I mean, intuitively, to me, it would seem to be very impactful if you have a 2-week heat wave versus, like you said, a 1-day heat wave. Yeah.
Thank you. Right. So any questions in the crowd? I'll come to you, David. I'll hand you this so that the audience can hear us.
Very, very interesting talk. What was special about the June 2021 Pacific Northwest event, and how consistent is what was happening there with your arguments about the tropics?
Yeah. Yeah, good question. So there's been quite a few studies in the Pacific Northwest heat wave. What seems to be coming out of those studies is that the ingredients that made it such an extreme event it wasn't one factor, but it seemed to be a collection of factors. So it was a blocking with quite a large temperature anomaly in the free troposphere, but not exceptionally large temperature anomaly. It combined with having relatively low soil moisture, so the dryness came into it, but also there was a signature of advection from the tropical Pacific. So in terms of that event, I think it's not clear to me that that particular event was ultimately limited by convection. So it seemed to, don't think anyone's actually done the study on what the convective upper limit for that event would be, but looking at the studies that have kind of investigated the synoptic meteorology of those events, it seemed to be not one of these classic events that's ended by convection, but the feeders were kind of you'd quite a strong blocking event, but also anomalously low soil moisture and some advection of heat from elsewhere, and that those ingredients made it an exceptional event. That's my understanding.
Any other questions in the audience? How's it looking online, Alan? Do I have any further questions on that? Stephanie, if you wish to ask yourself, then you can, if you're still there. And if not, I can ask Mike myself. No problem. You want to read it out, Alan, or should we bring it up on our screen?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So I guess you can define drought in different ways. So in terms of, if you wanted to translate this into, for example, precipitation changes, then there is a relationship between how humidity changes and how precipitation changes, but it's not a very direct one-to-one relationship, because you may have humidity increasing, but actually precipitation might be decreasing in a given region because the circulation might also be changing at the same time. But in general, this very large scale, in fact, global decrease in land relative humidity, in a sense, is indicating a drying out of the land that would be expected to influence, for example, evapotranspiration. So if you decrease near surface humidity, you're increasing the evaporative demand from the surface, which, all else being equal, would tend to kind of favor drought conditions. But I think it's quite a complex question. I think from my perspective, what's a really key question is how humidity is changing on those very, very hot days when you often have a drought. And it's unclear, I guess, what, think about near surface humidity, it's affected by moisture coming up from the surface through evaporation and transpiration. It's it's also affected by what's being advected around by the atmosphere, and it's quite unclear how those processes and how their changes with climate are affecting the near surface humidity. So I think that's quite a big open question that's important for heat waves, but also for wildfire risk, crops, many impacts. So, yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Great.
Well, many thanks again. Really fascinating talk, and good luck with everything. St Andrews will certainly be
Great.
keep engaging there.
Thanks.
Apologies for the slight delay, everyone, but thanks for around. Our next meeting is on the 12th of November. We've got a good range of talks this year, academic focused and less academic focused. And the next meeting, we've got Dr. Emma Bush and Dr. William Hinchcliffe from the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, looking at gardening and climate change, which will be quite interesting. In December, our talk, we've got Joe Farrow talking to us about the challenge of broadcast meteorology. And so please do all take a look at the program that's coming up. We've got some nice talks. But once again, many thanks to Mike, and hopefully see you all again soon.